Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, there have been emotional scenes in the heart of the Chadian capital Ndjamena as the coffin of the long-serving president Idris Deby arrived at his state funeral earlier in the day on Friday. His death in a battle with rebels was announced this week, and it stunned the nation and the region, where it's likely to have great implications in the fight against Boko Haram and other jihadist groups operating across the Sahel. As the world remembers the self-styled Field Marshal of Chad, we'll assess why Idris Deby's departure will have repercussions well beyond his landlocked country in the middle of the southern flank of the Sahara Desert. And later, it's the disease that kills more than 3,000 African children every day, and it's caused by a mosquito. For years, doctors have tried to solve the problem of malaria, but now, as the world prepares to mark the UN's World Malaria Day this Sunday, a group of researchers in Britain have developed a vaccine that's 77% successful in stopping infection in early clinical trials. We'll speak with the head of a Nigerian foundation that's promoting a test and treat malaria outreach program coming up. Now, the funeral of the long-serving president of Chad, Idris Deby, has taken place in Ndjamena after his dramatic death on the battlefront earlier this week. His son, Mohammed Idris Deby Itno, has replaced him in power as the head of a military council, a move the opposition says amounts to a coup. Among those who attended the funeral on Friday was the French President Emmanuel Macron, as well as several other regional heads of state. Mr. Macron, the United States and other Western countries were strong backers of the late president, who was seen as a close ally in the fight against Islamist militants in West Africa and the Sahel region.
Partage aussi le deuil d'un ami et d'un allié fidèle.
I share too the loss of a faithful friend and ally, because you were amongst the first to answer the call from countries in the region to defend Africa against armed terrorism in the Sahel in 2013, and to come to the rescue of your Malian friends side by side with France. You had realized that our common duty was to fight against this obscurantism that threatened and still threatens the region's states and populations in their freedoms and their existence and their dignity. France will never let anyone question and will never let anyone threaten, not today, not tomorrow, Chad's stability and integrity. France will also be here to support, without waiting, the promise of an appeased Chad making room for all of its children and all its elements. The transition will have to play that role. Stability, inclusion, dialogue, a democratic transition. We are and will stand by your side.
Chers frères et sœurs tchadiens,
Dear Chadians, brothers and sisters, with the sacrifice of His Excellency Idris Deby, cements your unity and your attachment to democratic values and throughout the rise and development of your dear republic. In this respect, be sure of Africa's Union's support during this transition period, that we wish to be peaceful, inclusive and democratic, in line with your country's fundamental law.
Number of people there speaking at the funeral of Idris Deby. Well, let's go to the Chadian capital Ndjamena now to speak to Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic. Good to see you, Karl. I hope you can hear me. First of all, just tell us how the funeral has unfolded and what sort of timetable there's been for the event, briefly.
Good afternoon, Charles. Yes, it's been a very emotional day for not only the Chadian people, but also for neighboring countries and Western partners who attended this hours-long ceremony to say farewell to one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, and that's Idris Deby Itno. It was a very moving ceremony in which the widow, after delivering a very short speech, she broke down in sobs, saying how much he meant to her and how much he meant to the country. And we saw, and to give an example, just how much he was held in high esteem by neighboring countries. We saw as many as 10 heads of states and prime ministers from the region, but also France's own Emmanuel Macron. So once that ceremony concluded, including a 21 guns salute using heavy artillery, they then moved on to a mosque where prayers were conducted and where the body was then handed over to the family. So now at about this time, the body of former President Idris Deby Itno, it's now been transferred, taken to his hometown where he grew up, Anjara. That's about 2 hours north of here, north of the capital, Ndjamena. So that's his final resting place. And that burial is taking place, we believe, as we speak right now. So it's been a day packed with ceremony, tradition, a lot of grief. When the widow started crying, you then heard an echo effect of people in the crowd also beginning to cry as well. Just thousands of people here under very, very hot conditions, more than 40 degrees, in other words, more than 100 degrees, as this was playing out this morning.
Well, thank you for setting out the day for us. But beyond the emotions and the funeral, of course, is the politics and the issues that have arisen as a result of his passing. And among those attending the funeral ceremony is Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who has not condemned the military takeover in Chad, but instead has given it what amounts to a sort of de facto recognition.
That's right, Charles. If anything, it's it's an endorsement, if not even a legitimization of a process that many had called unconstitutional, because according to Chad's constitution, the next in line of succession, if there's an emergency like this, it would be the Speaker of the Parliament. And the Speaker of the Parliament, he declined to step into that role, citing issues of poor health, especially at a time of a security crisis. And that's why the justification was to name the 37-year-old son, Mohammed Idris Deby Itno, despite his lack of experience as a leader and even as a military officer as well. I think there was concern as well that not only was there opposition to his being named as the head of this military council, not only opposition from the rebel group itself, which had been conducted the fighting in which Idris Deby Itno had been killed, but also from within the military itself and other members of his own tribe because of his lack of experience. So the Macron visit, basically, it was a ringing endorsement because Chad is just held as the most valuable partner in France's or the West strategy for controlling the fight against terrorism in the sub-Saharan African region. So that's what the visit was really all about. The only thing that we can say that may happen in the next few days is that the rebel opposition is suggesting that, well, they still would like to perhaps meet the military council, and the rebel leader is saying that he's willing to come to the capital to discuss this transition, to ensure that that this is no longer becomes a government that's run by the Deby Itno family.
Well, that's actually quite a very interesting development and something that you mentioned there. This idea of the rebel leader actually coming to sit down and have a chat with them. But talking about sitting down and having a chat, I mean, we understand that Mr. Macron has been meeting the leadership of the new ruling military council. Just taking what you were telling us further, do we have any idea what they were discussing?
Well, I don't have specific details, but what I can say, which you just have to remember, that Chad is the home base for France's largest operation in Africa, from which French troops are then deployed to neighboring countries from Mali, Niger, Cameroon, you name it. So I think it's a reassurance of France's continuing support and endorsement, and it's a reassurance saying that we will stand by you as you go through this difficult period of transition, and you're not alone in this. And just the sight of Macron, flying in overnight and appearing this morning, and speaking at length actually with the widow. When he spoke with the widow on his arrival for several minutes, people took note of that. So he's very, very concerned about how this situation unfolds, and he wants to make sure that it's not derailed by any opposition, not only from the rebels, but from within Mohammed Deby Itno's own people, own tribe, and the military itself, that France will back him and no one else.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, because I mean there are reports that his leadership is being contested or opposed by some within the army, and there are also reports that civil society groups have risen up in opposition to Emmanuel Macron's presence, saying that, you know, the fact that he's there is an endorsement of the military takeover and a thumbs up for what is effectively a coup. I mean, what can you tell us about all that?
Well, again, you keep this in mind, Charles, and you've got a very fragile situation with multiple crises, you know, all coming together at the same time. Almost a perfect storm, you could say, because he has to worry not so much about the opposition itself that's led by Muhammad Mahati Ali. He's the leader of the rebel group who says he'll come to Ndjamena to sit down and talk with, you know, the new president and members of the opposition party for a political reconciliation, if that's possible, because the nightmare scenario is what's happened in 2008 when you actually had fighting inside the city. So far that's not happening now, but what you have is a curfew situation until 8 p.m. every night, at least for the coming week, if not 2 weeks. But to get back to the crisis that are facing him, it's also economic crises. The biggest labor union, that's a syndicate of workers in Chad, the STC, they've gone on strike, Charles, at this time of the Macron visit. They've gone on strike saying that they haven't been paid for quite a long time, and that's now paralyzing businesses as well. I mean, what you see going on right now, I'm standing next to these fruit markets on the highway. You know, business is suffering right now because of all this uncertainty. People are afraid to go out, but they have to earn a living, and then they have to shut down in a few hours' time. So that's a problem right there. I mean, people are struggling right now, as it were before any of this happened. And now it's even made even worse by the uncertainty and the fact that they may be in a lockdown situation for the weeks to come. So the Macron visit is not only meant to revive the country politically, but to also perhaps, you know, help the economy itself begin its recovery by showing his partnership with the Chad government.
Karl, thank you very much indeed. We appreciate your giving us a good sense of what is going on in Chad and also what was happening at the funeral. Our special correspondent, Karl Bostic, talking to me there from the Chadian capital, Ndjamena. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our assessment of the repercussions of Idris Deby's departure. I'll be joined imminently by two top regional and international security analysts. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyekolu. Now, as you may know, the funeral of the long-serving president of Chad, Idris Deby, has taken place in the capital, N'Djamena. The president, whose death in a battle with rebels was announced this week, was a close ally of both regional and Western countries in the fight against militants in West Africa and the Sahel. As well as several African heads of state, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, also took part in the ceremony. French officials say Mr. Macron has held talks with the new leader of the country, the late president's son, General Mohamed Deby. Speaking at the funeral, he promised to honor his father's legacy, and others also spoke at the event. Right, we're expecting a clip there, but clearly it isn't there. So what are the long-term issues facing Chad, a country which has such a key strategic role in the region? Well, for analysis, I'm joined now from London by the international security analyst, Chidi Nwaonu, and here in the studio by the regional defense and security analyst, Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who's also the CEO of Beacon Consulting, a security firm with a focus on the West African sub-region and the Sahel. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us, basically, because you're just coming in, aren't you? Well, let's go first of all to Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who is on the ground here and has been keeping a close eye on developments in the Sahel region. Would you say that basically this we're hearing a lot of reports, let me put it that way, that reports of discord within the army, that there's said to have been little consultation with regard to the composition of the military council, which was apparently set up by a very small circle who were close to Mohammed Idris Deby, who is now, of course, the leader of that military council. What are you hearing about that?
Thank you, Charles. The same thing. It's very obvious that the ethnic and to an extent the clannish composition of Chad as a country, and then the military as well, would play into this transition. Let's remember that fact itself, the rebel group that quote unquote led to the death of Idris Deby, also fell out with him, mainly because of this alleged lack of inclusion. A group of generals who felt they were not carried along and then fell out with his government, then became rebels, moved to Libya. So that is currently playing out as well. And a lot of analysts have, and including myself, have pointed to the fact that what would mark the early days of the new head of the junta, Madma Kaka, would be how he plays out all of these balancing elements, including the ethnic and clannish compositions of the military, as well as the political opposition that are also not happy with the fact that democracy has been jettisoned. So in these early days, and I'm very happy that this speech he gave today, he talked about inclusion, he talked about democracy, he talked about continuity. Now, if by that he means enhancing and strengthening the tenets of democracy within Chad, then we're hoping that in the next few days we would see engagement across the strata of society, including these generals that are unhappy. If, however, he means a continuation of the sidelining of certain segments of society, then unfortunately it would mean a continuation of some of the rebellious actions that we saw during his father's tenure.
Well, I mean, let me come to you there in London, Chidi and Nwaonu. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just coming off the back of Dr. Kabiru there, from what we're hearing, this new military dispensation is being contested or opposed by a lot of groups in Chad, and many find it particularly irksome that the French president is ignoring the opinion of most Chadians, including the trade unions, opposition parties, civil society, and even the rebels, and giving his support to the military junta. What are your thoughts on that? What are you hearing?
Well, first, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. And I think Dr. Kabiru's point is very well taken in that there is a fairly complex mix of personalities and factions who need to be managed in this situation. And Deby Senior, or the Deby deceased, was quite good at managing this through a combination of repression, violence, and also bringing in foreign sponsors. And also, he was a soldier. Whatever we think of him as an individual or as a leader, as in the context of his country, he was a soldier. You can see this. He enjoyed fighting, or maybe he was good at fighting, and he was good at leading from the front. However, the factionalization of Chad is much more complex than even a country like Nigeria, which has many competing factions. The factions exist within the Deby family. This son has other sons challenging him from other wives of Deby. Within the wider Deby family, there's uncles, cousins who have led rebel groups challenging Deby himself. Within his wider tribe, there's other people. It's a small tribe within Chad who have dominated the key security positions. There's many of those elder people other factions, other clans who feel they should be in charge of the country. And then the wider kind of Chadian narrative of other tribes from the north, other tribes from the south thinking it should be their turn. Deby was able to manage this, as I said, with a combination of bringing in foreign sponsors and, through control of the military and through repression. The son, it's unclear how much in control he is, whether he's been put there as a figurehead, whether he had any, whether he really is in control, and how he's going to be able to balance all these factions is key. Now, from the French point of view, what they need above all else is a stable Chad that can support their operations in the Sahel. Because without Chad, they either have to make up these troop numbers by themselves, and it's going to be difficult to draw troops from French efforts elsewhere, because France is quite heavily committed both in the homeland and abroad. And at the same time, they've also got to factor in that if Chad descends into internal crisis with factions fighting factions, unable to fight off the different rebel groups, unable to contain ISWAP, unable to support operations in the wider Sahel, then that again will be another call on French forces, because they obviously have a debt to pay. The French, the Chadians supported the French. The Chadians will then expect the French to support them if there's a crisis at home. So I think the French are between a rock and a hard place. As much as they would like to get out of the Sahel and kind of wash their hands of this problem, without supporting whatever is happening in Chad, or whatever vision of a stable government exists in Chad, they will never be able to get out of the Sahel. So I think that we need to watch what happens in Chad and how they balance these factions, and that will tell a lot about where the chips will fall.
Very good points there, Chidi. Let me bring Dr. Adamu back in. It sounds like a right royal mess, I mean, to be fair. But the one constant that I notice in all of this appears to be the military credentials, the security credentials of Idris Deby, which appear to be unimpeachable, because beyond Mr. Macron, who's there are other regional leaders. He was seen as a major force in the fight against jihadists, wasn't he?
Exactly. His role as a stabilization force, for lack of a better word, within the sub-region and within the East and Central Africa bloc is almost undisputed and frankly unrivaled. So there is a lot of concern about who would take up that role. It's not likely that, given the fact that his son is more or less a greenhorn in terms of the political ramifications of what governance would be, both in the sub-region and in the country, Chad as a whole, that he would immediately be able to take up that role. Perhaps in the long term, depending on how he's able to stabilize the government and what kind of support he's able to get, both locally and internationally, maybe. But for now, definitely that concern is there.
Okay.
Someone who has played the role of a stabilizing force is no longer there. It's quite significant that the East and Central African bloc has more or less kept quiet about all of this development.
Well, let's come back and talk about that. I'll come straight back to you, but I've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our assessment of the repercussions of the death of Idris Deby in Chad and the wider region. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. A funeral for the long-serving president of Chad, Idris Deby, has taken place in the capital, Ndjamena. Mr. Deby, whose death stunned the nation, the region, and Chad's international allies just a day after he'd been declared the winner in a highly disputed presidential election, was apparently killed in a battle with rebels. France and African leaders in the Sahel are backing the new military leadership headed by the late president's son, General Mohamed Deby. The opposition in Chad is calling for civilian rule. Correspondents say there are concerns about the country's stability, with rebel groups saying they will seize power. And with me from London, the international security analyst, Chidi Nwaonu, and here in the studio, the regional defense and security analyst, Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who's also CEO of Beacon Consulting, a security firm with a focus on the West African sub-region and the Sahel. And let me come straight to you, Kabiru, because you were completing a thought before we had to take a break. Please proceed.
Thank you, Charles. I was talking about the regional bloc, the Eastern Central African regional bloc, and the role, well, I expected them to have played. First during the elections, and then when the rebel movement started encroaching and attacking Chad, as it were. And then, of course, even during the transition. Now, in most parts of Africa, regional blocs start this process. In the case of the ECCA, they do have a COPAX, which is the Council for Protection and Security, something like that. Now that council, I expected a greater role from that council, and the inability of that council to step in, I think, unfortunately, has created some of the issues that we spoke about earlier on, that is leading to some persons questioning the transition. Now, at the continental level, AU should have also played that role, either directly or through the Eastern Central African, regional bloc. So again, emphasizing the role of multilateralism in these types of crises. Over the time we have seen repeatedly in Africa where this crisis start and then where at the very early stages when we have the opportunity to limit their consequences, unfortunately multilateralism and in some instances bilateralism is unable to take care of them, and then the result is that they blossom into a bigger challenge. And so right now the question is being asked, what happens if the situation in Libya repeats itself in Chad, and the consequences on the sub-region?
That's a very good point, because I actually heard the Nigerian foreign minister the other day addressing precisely that question, because he was very worried that he was being asked, well, why isn't Nigeria speaking out about democracy? And he's saying, look, the bigger issue is instability, because if we have a repeat of what happened in Libya, look at the consequences of what happened in Libya for the whole of the continent. Imagine what would happen to the West African sub-region, the Central Africa, the Sahel, if the same sort of thing happens in Chad.
Exactly, and I think this is the time for the multilateral bodies, I have mentioned them, the Eastern Central African Bloc, AU, and even bastions of democracy like the US and France, to speak up. I'm happy with the language, but again, it also, and for me, France would have a huge issue to clear beyond what is obvious. There is a lot of conspiracy theories that are out there. The relationship between France and General Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and the fact that this group had the blessing of General Khalifa Haftar, and the fact that they were able to move from Libya. Now, a lot of conspiracy theories are out there. So I think it's absolutely necessary that France, over the coming days and weeks and probably months, plays out a role that clarifies very, very, in a very clear manner that its role as a bastion and champion of democracy in both the continent and globally is not questioned. Currently, that role is being questioned.
That's a good point. Let me come to you, Chidi Nwaonu. Just on following up on what Dr. Kabiru was saying there, what contradictory message does it send out when a country like Nigeria says that it is much more concerned about closing a power vacuum rather than following the constitution of Chad, which clearly states that the vice president or the president of the National Assembly take over the levers of power when the president is no longer able to do so?
Well, I don't think Nigeria has ever been worried about being contradictory. I mean, the great champion of Sierra Leonean democracy was General Abacha, somebody who, participated in every coup in Nigeria up until his death. When we look at Nigeria as it's currently set up, we have a democratic government. We've had democratic governments for the best part of for over 20 years, but following the law doesn't necessarily seem to be something that any of the governments of any iteration have been good at. So I would think that the supposed hypocrisy, is kind of par for the course. I mean, but it's also realpolitik. Chad, as Dr. Adamu said, very accurately, Chad occupies a very key position in Africa. It's bordered by some very naughty areas. It's got Libya, it's got Nigeria, the Lake Chad Basin, it's got Cameroon, it's got Central African Republic, and it's got Sudan. Every single one of those countries has issues. And the point is that an implosion in Chad, Chad descending into civil war or becoming essentially like Nigeria, unable to protect itself and its own people, and also unable to project power outside its borders, creates an additional problem for not just West Africa but Central Africa, Northern Africa as well. And you can see the second and third order effects of everything that happens in Africa. Obviously, the second order effect of the defeat of Gaddafi was, the spread of weapons, the invasion of Mali, and the second order effect of a peace treaty in Libya was, one of the conditions of which was the removal of foreign forces, of which fact were foreign forces fighting after, was that these guys then just upsticked, went home to start a fight in Chad, and we can all see the consequence of that. So, without being able to factor in all of these kind of second order unknowns, every single power in the region is just hoping for stability. And then, as unfortunate as it sounds, once we can establish stability, then we can worry about, the niceties of democracy and succession later on. But the key thing right now is let Chad not implode. And I think that's what everybody is trying to hold on to.
Yes, that makes sense. But Dr. Adamu, is there, though, a bigger issue to do with the perception of countries like Nigeria on democracy in the region? Because, clearly Idris Deby was an ally of Nigeria, especially with regard to security and fighting insurgents in the region, Boko Haram, etc. But he'd been in power for more than 30 years. How does a country like Nigeria democratically justify that? Or is there a sense that the length of time he served does not necessarily mean that the system of democracy is absent or flawed, because he, of course, and that's the argument he'll make, kept winning elections? Exactly,
and it appears that the textbook that most African leaders sort of read and follow. Cameroon, a neighboring country, also in the same bloc,
absolutely
has the same circumstance. In fact, I doubt if there's anywhere in Africa that you pick that you would not see a reputation. The latest one is Somali. So quite worrisome, because at the root cause of the crisis, the security challenges that this country are having, are their inability to follow the democratic tenets and systems of government, where the space is unfortunately squeezed, where players are disallowed to participate, and then some of them unfortunately pick up arms against the government. Typical scenario virtually everywhere within Africa. And so it's quite worrisome that despite the number of years that African governments and Africa as a continent has seen, democracy and what it could deliver, we are unable to grow. I worry in the sense that, of course, even from internal controls within those countries, and then the effect of multilateralism, because there is most of these countries belong to either continental multilateral bodies that profess to be champions of democracy, and at the international level, they are almost all of them members of the UN and several other bodies. So it worries me that most of this are rather just spoken, and that there is what I would describe maybe as a resentment really for implementing the tenets of democracy. And perhaps that's the way to go as we proceed in this conversation. How do we strengthen democracy in these countries? How do we ensure the principles of equity, justice, and inclusion in governance? Like I said earlier on, I'm very happy with the statements by the leader of the junta, as well as President Macron during the burial of late Field Marshal Idris Deby. Those are good statements, those are promises, but then how do they translate that into the realities that we're seeing on ground? Unfortunately, I think that is what leaves a lot of us to beg for answers and to insist that a country like France, given its role as a member of the United Nations Security Council, and as a country that has 5,000 troops in Chad, and as a country that has strategic interest in the Sahel and in the continent, should, if nothing, promote the democratic tenets, as against what we have seen to be a tacit endorsement of a coup d'etat.
Very good points. And let me bring you in, Chidi Nwaonu, to react to that and give us your own assessment. Because, with all this opposition, the bottom line really is what the military are going to do. There's a lot of opposition in the country from the trades unions, civil society, opposition parties, and so on. And now apparently, although that's not confirmed, discord within the army. Are there any signs at all, Any whispers that you're hearing with your contacts that suggest that the military are prepared to make any concessions, the new leadership in Chad?
I think it's too early to tell. I mean, they obviously have to get their heads around what the situation is or how they're going to play this. And as I said, the factionalization in Chad is quite, complex. I mean, even within the military itself, there are two types of military. There's the special forces, the presidential guards, the Republican Guard, the elites, again, mainly from Deby's ethnic group. Who are well paid, well equipped, and then there's the rest of the army who just a few years ago, or maybe a year back, had their pay cut, because oil prices were down. He cut their pay, and it was only I think a few years ago, or maybe a year back, where their pay was reinstated to previous levels. So that level of discontent exists, and again, considering they're constantly on operations either against ISWAP or in the Sahel or down the Central African Republic. This is what I'm saying. It's very important to note the next few days. What is the method that the junta? I mean, and I hesitate to call it, Mohammed Deby's regime, because I am not convinced that he's truly, 100% in charge. But it's important to note what moves the junta takes in the next few days. Whether they begin, conciliatory gestures towards the rebels, towards other factions, towards different elements of the army, and then, kind of consolidated that way, or whether they go into an aggressive stance where they take on all challenges and then try and eliminate their challenges through violence or repression. It's very key to note that. And if repression works for them, again, it'll be a temporary fix, because all the things we're talking about, all the things that you mentioned earlier about people, how democracy has been subverted across Africa, where people like Deby, I can't remember the guy, the name of the fellow in Benin Republic as well, who has done, I think Talon, who has done the same thing, subverted what are ostensibly democratic principles in order to perpetuate themselves in power.
Okay, Chidi, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're out of time, but absolutely fascinating talking to you. Chidi Nwaonu, the international security analyst, talking to me from London. And also thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kabiru Adamu, who is the CEO of Beacon Consulting and certainly one of the top security and defense analysts in the West African region. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including as the world prepares to mark World Malaria Day this Sunday, researchers in Britain have developed a vaccine that's 77% successful in stopping infection in early clinical trials. Stay with us.